Under Swiss law, a fine is not considered as a damage. Of course, here it is debatable whether the monies ultimately paid by the Swiss banks to the US Department of Justice can be considered as a fine as such.
So, Alexander, can Swiss banks withhold clients' money to protect their alleged claims?
On the basis of the most recent case law of the Swiss Supreme Court, it appears that yes, they can, but under certain circumstances and conditions only. The most recent decision that I'm referring to was issued in the context of the Madoff fraud. I will not dwell here on what the Madoff case is. It is a well-known or now well-known Ponzi scheme that was set up by Bernie Madoff as an investment fund into which, in fact, clients invested monies, but no investments were made with the client monies. And it was extremely sophisticated in the sense that it enjoyed great confidence in the market, and billions of dollars were invested by bankers on behalf of their clients. Over the years, redemptions were made where certain clients sold their shares, or what they believed to be their shares, in a real investment funds, and withdrew monies from the fund, with the result that after the collapse, the liquidator of the fund sued the banks that had redeemed shares in order to reconstruct the asset base of the investment fund and pay all creditors an equal share as dividend in this bankruptcy. The result is that certain Swiss banks were facing lawsuits in the US directed against themselves directly, but in relation to monies they had invested and then redeemed on behalf of clients. So the action those Swiss banks took was to block the funds when they were still available of the clients on whose behalf they had invested in the scheme. The clients, of course, objected to their monies being blocked, stating that the claim that the bank alleged to exercise against the client was not directly related to matter between the bank and the client, but related to a potential lawsuit or the threat of a lawsuit, or a lawsuit that had not yet, let's say, found its outcome between a third party, namely the liquidator in the Madoff fund, and the bank. So the Swiss courts had to decide whether Swiss banks are entitled to withhold the client monies until the lawsuits in the US are solved between the liquidator and the bank, and possibly if the liquidator prevails in these lawsuits and if the banks are obliged to pay back the equivalent of the redemptions or part of this, if the banks then can repay themselves on the monies of their clients. And in a few words, the answer given by the Swiss courts to this question is yes, the banks are entitled to withhold client monies if the account opening documents foresee such a right of retention or clawback in relation to claims exercised against the bank by third parties related to the client monies. So the banks, Swiss banks, have been comforted by this decision, which was not good news for the customers, the affected customers, but which brought certain clarity to a question that was vividly debated among scholars and lawyers in the industry.
So is there any other situation where Swiss banks have exercised clawback methods against their customers?
More recently, as you may have followed, certain Swiss banks, over 100 of them, participated in the so-called US program set up by the United States Department of Justice for Swiss banks. It was a voluntary program that allowed Swiss banks to enter into a non-prosecution agreement, coming clean in relation to past US undeclared assets. The banks had to disclose the amount of US assets they were holding, and were requested to pay a fine, or negotiated the payment of a fine in relation to those US related accounts for which they could not demonstrate that the account had been declared to the US tax authorities, the Internal Revenue Service. In relation to certain US client monies or client US related accounts, the banks claimed lately that they had been surprised to discover that these accounts were US related, because the customer had allegedly failed to disclose his nexus to the United States, the fact that he was a US national or US resident. And in those cases where the banks still had monies on account, some of them are now blocking these accounts and pretend to exercise a clawback, similar to the Madoff situation, and to repay themselves of part of the fine they paid at the end of last year for most of them to the US Department of Justice in the context of this program. The situation, however, is slightly different from the Madoff case. First of all, some of these banks could have ascertained the US nature or US character of their clients by being more careful, more diligent in their Know Your Customer identification process. Secondly, under Swiss law, a fine is not considered as a damage. Of course, here it is debatable whether the monies ultimately paid by the Swiss banks to the US Department of Justice can be considered as a fine as such, because this was a voluntary program and the fines ultimately were subject to certain negotiation. And the third issue is that the banks will probably be unable to demonstrate a clear-cut link between the US related accounts in question and the fine they paid to the US government, because the Department of Justice will not confirm that the fine was specifically related to this or that account. So it could make it difficult for banks to demonstrate before Swiss courts that the alleged damage they incurred was directly related to the specific US related account on which they now pretend to exercise a clawback.
Thank you for joining us in our studios once again, Alexander.
Always a pleasure.
That's all for today's interview, but don't forget to click on our Facebook page and follow us on Instagram to get the latest for the Dukascopy TV team. Goodbye for now.